I first got involved in Christian apologetics before I ever knew what the word apologetics meant, actually. It seems like a bit of a technical term, but I grew up in a city called Leicester in the Midlands of England, and it was famous for a number of things, most recently for having a very good football team. But before that, it was the first city, apparently, in the UK to have an ethnic majority, which means that there were more people from a non-British background in the city. So it meant growing up, I had a lot of friends at school who were from different religious backgrounds. And although I had grown up in a Christian environment, I'd heard about Jesus as a child, a lot of the people around me had different religious beliefs. Some of them would call themselves atheists and so on. And in this particular school, we started what we called a Christian union. It was a group for Christians to meet together, but there were only 3 people in the school who would have regarded themselves as, well, at least publicly, as Christian. And so we used to meet together, but it was a little bit boring being such a small group. So then we used to put on these public events called Guerrilla Christian, where we would invite anybody just to come and ask their questions about Christianity over a lunchtime. And I remember we organized the first one of these. It was in room 22. It was the room where we studied religion at school. And I didn't know whether anyone would come, but I arrived in the room and there were about 60 or 70 people crammed into this classroom. And it was mayhem. There were no teachers. People were throwing things across the room and smoking out of the back window. And then I introduced an older Christian friend who was going to answer the questions. And I'll never forget that lunchtime because all the kind of normal hostile questions came from these arrogant teenage boys. It was an all-boys school. But my friend would just respond to them clearly and succinctly, sometimes humorously. I remember sitting there thinking like, there are answers to these questions. I was used to hearing about Christianity in a church context, but hearing the Christian faith not only explained, but defended in a secular context of a school classroom in my lunch break was just a really eye-opening and revolutionary experience for me. And I remember thinking as probably about a 14-year-old boy, I couldn't do that. I couldn't answer those kind of questions on the spot. But then I also thought I'd love to be able to do that one day. I'd love to be able to hear the questions that people have and respond to them in that kind of environment. So actually, as a 14-year-old, I'd say that was the first encounter that I really had with what we might now call Christian apologetics, and really the motivation for me to want to know about my faith enough that I would be able to respond to the questions and the objections that people might have about it. Yeah, I've spent my life trying to engage with people's questions and the doubts that they have. And I love doing that actually, because I think it's as we ask our questions and as we raise our doubts that we can actually discover more about the truth and the goodness of the Christian faith. Actually, doubts can be a means by which we discover faith and how our faith can also grow. And I guess there are 3 types of questions that I've encountered over the years. The kind of questions that revolve around whether Christianity is true would be the first type. Um, and that revolves around questions like, does God exist? What's the evidence for God? What about science? How does that fit with the Bible? What's the evidence for the historicity of the gospel accounts? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And so on. Is it true kind of questions? And then there's a second group of questions, and I would say these are more moral objections. They're questions about whether it's good. How can God be good when he has only one way, when he sends people to hell, when he limits my sexuality and so on? Moral objections to the character of God rather than intellectual objections to the existence of God. And then there's kind of like a third group of questions, and that's more, does it work? What difference does it make? It might be true, it might work in theory, but how does this impact my life? How does it connect with the things that I care about? How does it explain the things that are the most important things in my life? And so I would suggest questions really come into those 3 categories. Is it true? Is it good? Does it work? And they're really important questions that we need to ask about any belief system. And of course, really important that we ask about the Christian faith. I think it's a commonly held myth that there's this battle or this warfare between science and Christianity. And it was actually certainly put forward by a couple of books that became very influential in the field a couple of 100 years ago. One of them was literally called On the Warfare Between Science and Christianity, which kind of narrated this story of a continual battle between the advancement of science and the preservation of religion. And what's interesting, I call it a myth because actually, when you start to look into the history of Christianity and the history of the modern study of science, it really doesn't correspond with the reality that we find for a few reasons. Firstly, the modern study of science didn't grow out of an atheistic worldview, it grew out of a Christian worldview. Most of the, we might call them the fathers of modern science, were people who had a Christian commitment. And it was precisely because of their Christian commitment and a God who created the world with order and design that they were inspired to study science in the first place. So if you go to Cambridge, I was there just not long ago, the Cavendish Laboratory, which is where Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. Above the doorway to that laboratory, you've got some verses from the Bible inscribed into the door. And it says, great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by those who delight in him. A quotation from the book of Psalms in the Bible. And that shows that actually some of the people who were really at the forefront and the pioneers of science believed that they were actually discovering the works of God. One person said, God has given us two books, his word, the Bible, and his works, nature. And we can study, and we should study them both. And actually, if you look around the world today, yes, there are scientists who are atheists, but there are plenty of scientists who are also Christian believers. And they don't see any contradiction between their scientific study and their Christian commitment. In fact, for many people, they would say that their scientific study increases their sense of wonder at God and his creation. So they work very much in cooperation, in partnership together. The other thing I'd say is that often the reason why people have this view that there's a conflict between science and God is that people have the wrong view of God. People sometimes talk about this idea of a God of the gaps, the idea that God does the things that we don't understand. And of course, if that is where God dwells, in the gaps of our scientific knowledge, then the more we know about science, the less we need God. But of course, actually, the Christian understanding of God is not a God of the gaps. He's the God of the whole show. He's the God who created everything. Finding how things work doesn't remove the need for someone to create it in the first place. I was just using an illustration yesterday in a talk that I was giving about the Dyson Airblade hand dryer. Maybe you've been into a public toilet and you find these hand dryers and you dip your hands in, and they're very effective, aren't they, at cleaning or drying rather your hands very quickly. Now imagine I try and find Mr. Dyson. And so I open up the Airblade and I start looking around for this little man who lives inside the machine. But of course, I'll never find Mr. Dyson inside the machine because he was the creator of the machine. He's outside of and separate to his creation. And if God is the creator, then of course he's outside of and separate to his creation. Stephen Hawking, the great physicist, famously said, God has run out of justifications because our greatest microscopes and telescopes haven't found him. But of course, that's to look for God in his creation, which is like looking for Mr. Dyson in the Airblade. It's looking for God in the wrong places. If God is the God of the whole show, then discovering how things work doesn't remove the need for the creator and the designer in the first place. So I would see that actually they're not in conflict with each other, but they naturally flow together. And a study of science would be a natural outworking of a belief in God as informed by the Bible. I find it fascinating about the misconceptions that people have when it comes to Christianity. And I guess depending on our experience of Christianity and our particular exposure to it, the misconceptions that we have might be quite different. Obviously, there are different branches of Christianity around the world, and each one of them will have particular emphases and so on. What I find really interesting is that if you go back to the first century and you look at the growth of Christianity in the first century, you'll discover that Christians were often called atheists when they first started spreading this message about Jesus. Now, that's not because they didn't believe in God. Obviously, they did. But it's because their beliefs and practices were so different to all the other religious systems around that they just didn't fit into the kind of category of religion in the first century Roman Empire. They didn't have a temple. They didn't meet in specific buildings. They didn't have a priesthood. In fact, they talked about everyone being a priest and equally of value and importance. They didn't sacrifice animals. They believed that Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice and so on. And so because of this, they got called atheists. Now, I found that really interesting because in the first century, Christianity was seen as radically different from every religious system that was known. And yet, one of the things that's happened over 2,000 years is that people have now placed Christianity just into the same category of religion alongside everything else. But I would say, actually, when you start to look at the heart of the Christian faith, it's actually really different in so many ways. And when we put it in the category of religion, we assume it's all about going to a building, about going through certain rituals and rules, and ultimately about earning our way to acceptance with God and ultimately to heaven with God in the future. Whereas actually the heart of Christianity is something quite different. There's a wonderful line in one of the songs by the band U2 where it says, "Grace walks outside of karma." And I love that because karma is basically the idea that we get what we deserve. And there are certain Eastern religions that practice and teach karma. But in a sense, you might say karma lies at the heart of all religious systems, this idea that I do good things in the hope that I will get good in return. But one of the things that is so unique about the heart of the message of the Bible and the message of Jesus is that it's not a message of karma, but a message of grace. If karma teaches that we get what we deserve, then grace is actually the message that we get what we don't deserve. It's an undeserved gift. And I'd say that the heart of the Christian message is not us trying to obey the rules in order that God might accept us, because the Bible says that we've all failed. None of us could meet that perfect standard. But it is a message of how God came down, taking the consequences that we deserve so that we could be offered something that we don't deserve, a relationship with God that starts now and goes on through death into eternity. So I would say when you start to look at the heart of Jesus, who he is, what he claimed about himself, what he offers, we see that's so different. But many people's perception of Christianity isn't really formed on looking at the life and teaching of Jesus. It's often formed by their experience of people who profess to be Christians, or maybe some experience of going to a church. And that can vary dramatically depending on the Christians they've met and the church they've attended. But ultimately, Christianity, well, it's about Christ. The clue is in the name, isn't it? It's Christianity. So my encouragement is whatever our conceptions or misconceptions are of the Christian faith, we kind of need to look at Jesus himself to understand what it's really about. I think the question about suffering is probably the hardest question for Christians to deal with. And also, I would suggest it's probably the most common question, because while some questions are relevant to a particular cultural moment or a particular point in history, obviously the reality of suffering is one that has existed throughout time and in all cultures. So how would we respond to it? Well, there's no simple answer. But then I'd also say, depending on your worldview, there are no simple answers. And one of the things actually I find compelling about the Christian faith is not that it has a simple, easy answer in response to suffering, but I do think it makes more sense than the way that other worldviews and beliefs try and make sense of suffering. And ultimately, the reality is all of us have to make sense of it somehow. Whether or not I believe in God, whether or not I'm religious, we all live in a suffering world. We will all experience suffering. How are we going to make sense of it? Not just in theory when we're sitting in a lecture room, but in practice when it's happening to us. And one of the inadequacies that I found with the atheistic or the naturalistic worldview is that ultimately it struggles to account for why suffering even is a bad thing in the first place. If the only story of reality that's worth believing is that I am the end result of an accidental process where the only reason for my existence is the need to survive, then why is suffering such a bad thing? I mean, things just exist. Death and decay have always been part of reality. This is just the way the world is. So the sense of talking about the problem of suffering doesn't really make sense within the atheistic worldview. It's not a problem, it's just a thing, like everything else is a thing. We can't really give it a moral judgment. And then, of course, there are other religious worldviews, and often religions have grown out of this desire to try and grapple with the problem of suffering. That was certainly the case for Buddhism. But Buddhism would say the way to deal with suffering is to basically recognize that suffering comes from our desire and we need to suppress that desire. And if we can suppress our desire, then obviously suffering will no longer be a problem. But actually, I wouldn't suggest it was a bad thing for us to desire a world that is good. In fact, as a Christian, I would say that is a good thing. It's an inbuilt part of what it means to be human. And then, of course, the Islamic worldview would say, well, Allah is sovereignly in control of all things and all things come from him. So we just submit. That's what the word Islam means. It means to submit. So we submit to his will. We don't question it. But I would say when it comes to the Christian faith, in one sense, we aren't just to submit to suffering as if it's just a natural part of our world. In fact, in a sense, the Bible story says this isn't a natural part of our world. You look right back to the beginning of the Bible. It talks about how God creates a world that's good, a world without suffering, a world without disease, a world without death. And then it talks about how into that good world, God created people with a choice to live in that world God's way or to live in that world their own way. And the tragedy of human history is, of course, that people took that choice and they used it to reject God, to ruin his world and to ruin their relationships with God and with each other. Now, we might say, well, why did God give people a choice? I mean, why would God create a good world and then give people the ability, the possibility of messing it up? I think part of the answer is that God has given us choice because God is a God of love, and love and choice have to go together. If I'm to have a loving relationship with someone, I cannot force them to love me back. There has to be a willingness, a choice, a freedom on their part. And it's the same with God. If God is going to create a world where love is possible, there has to be the possibility that I could choose not to love God or not to love other people. But the tragedy is that often we have done that and we find ourselves in the mess that we're in. But also, I'd say that's not the end of the story, thankfully. Yes, the world we live in is not the way it once was. But if you fast forward right to the very final book of the Bible, we discover the world we live in is not the way it one day will be. And so the penultimate chapter of the final book of the Bible has this beautiful picture of this world being restored and transformed and suffering being taken away. And that's a beautiful vision of the future. Very different, actually, to many other religious systems, because Christian salvation is not about escaping this world to another dimension. It's about the transformation and the renewal of this creation that God created in the first place. And then right in the middle of the story, we see that there's a God who understands our suffering. So we see in Jesus, God himself coming into our broken, suffering world and experiencing himself the whole range of human suffering, exclusion. He lived as a refugee, misunderstanding, torture, injustice, ultimately crucifixion, probably the most horrific form of execution ever invented. If I am to believe the claim of the Bible that Jesus was not just a prophet or a teacher, but he was God himself, then I have to also believe that therefore God is not distant from my suffering, but he's a God who stepped into our suffering, has experienced it, has done something about it, and wants through his death and resurrection to make it possible for me to be in a world one day where suffering is going to be a thing of history. So we don't have all the answers, not exhaustive answers certainly, but I would say there's a sufficient answer to make faith in Jesus reasonable and to give us a foundation that enables us to face the suffering of our worlds with a sense of hope and a sense of meaning in light of where we know things have come from, but also wonderfully where things are going in the future. I think the question of what is our purpose or what is the meaning of life is one of the biggest questions that we can ask. Interestingly, in the story, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they famously discovered that the meaning of life was apparently 42, but then they didn't really understand the question. So what is the meaning? What is the purpose to life? Actually, that's a particularly big question, I would suggest, in this particular cultural moment that we're in. People have often talked about a meaning crisis. And that is because there's a kind of cognitive dissonance, a confusion among contemporary culture. What do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, we're told that we're nothing more than the evolutionary process. And there is nothing more than the physical stuff that makes up our universe. There's no spiritual dimension. There's no God. There's nothing that isn't physical. We are just, responding to the firings of our neurons and so on. And in that story of reality, the only thing that really matters is my survival and yours. So everything is judged according to the need to survive. That's a very basic view of reality. But on the other hand, we live in a society where we say that humans are worthy of human rights, and the world is worth caring for, and the environment is worth protecting. And that there are certain really important things like consent when it comes to sex that are really, really important and real. But the difficulty is, how do we account for the things that seem really important, like human rights and caring for the environment and the importance of consensual relationships, if at the end of the day, I am just the result of the evolutionary process and the only thing that really matters is passing on my DNA? Really hard to account for all these things that seem so important in life. And that's caused many people to ask the question, is there another story of reality that better accounts for the things that really count in life? Is there a story that makes sense of the things that matter most? And I would suggest actually that there is. And that's one of the ways that we could test the validity of any worldview, by the way. We can ask, does it make sense of reality? And I would say the problem with naturalism is that it doesn't. When we step outside the lecture room and all the things that really matter to us in life suddenly don't find any accounting for in the things that we've been talking about. Whereas if the Christian story is true, I'd suggest it gives a much greater accounting for these things. So why are human beings valuable? Well, because the Bible says God created human beings with unique dignity and value. We're not just valuable because we are functionally able to do things that animals don't do, but God has given us value. It's intrinsic to who we are. We are human beings, not human doings. As someone said, our value doesn't come from what we do, it comes from who we are. How do we account for the importance of love and consensual relationships? Well, the Bible describes God as a loving relationship. That's what the idea of the Trinity is: God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. It's the idea that God is a loving relationship. And if God created us in his image, that doesn't just give us value, but it shows us why love is important, because I'm created to reflect the God who is love and created me in his image, and so on. Why do I care for the environment? Well, because actually this world was a gift that was given to us, but for us to look after. And so if I believe that this world was created by God and I love God, then I will want to love the things that God has made. And so I would say caring for the environment finds a much greater, stronger motivation within a Christian worldview than on a naturalistic worldview. Who cares if I trash the world as long as I survive? That's the story of Darwinian evolution. But actually, the story of the Bible is, no, it's not just my survival that's important. Love is really important. Love of God, love of his world, love of other people. And so when we start to look at it, we find that actually there seems to be a better accounting for the things that really matter in life when we look at the Christian story. Now, we might have big questions about whether the Christian story is true, but if we see that it makes sense of things in a way that other stories don't, that would be at least a good reason for asking the question, well, is it true? Is it not just an attractive story, but is it a true story of reality? And actually, I think when we look at that, we discover that that's also the case. Whenever I get asked the question about my favorite book or my favorite verse, I think of a different answer. So this will have to be the answer that I give today. Well, maybe not. Maybe this is actually my favorite book. But I love the whole Bible, and there are lots of books that would be up there. But I love the book of 2 Corinthians. It's second one, maybe the third letter, if there was one that was lost in between, that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, a church that he had planted, a church that had lots of problems. But in 2 Corinthians, he writes really personally about his own trials and challenges, his own experience of coming to know Jesus, and his own experience of sharing Jesus. And I love the kind of personal nature of 2 Corinthians. And I think if you were to press me, not just my favorite book, but my favorite verse, which I know you haven't asked me for, but I'm going to give you, it would be 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. And Paul says, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. In other words, God has put the treasure of his gospel, the good news of Jesus, into jars of clay. Now, that's maybe not an analogy that works for us today. Maybe a plastic carrier bag would be a similar analogy. We're just weak, we're fragile, we're nothing special, but God has put something really special within us, and we've got this treasure that we can share. And I found that so encouraging because we're often very aware of our own inadequacies. And one of the things that the Bible does is it says, that's fine. We are inadequate, we are weak, we are fragile, but we have this treasure, the treasure of the good news of Jesus that God has given to us. And we also have that treasure to share with other people. And in a sense, therefore, our weaknesses and our inadequacies are the very things that qualify us to serve God. I remember as a 17-year-old boy walking down the road to my house with a friend of mine, and he was everything that I wanted to be, but I felt that I wasn't. He was popular, he was sporty, he was eloquent, he was extroverted. He had all the things that I wanted, and I felt I've got nothing. Who am I? I was a weak, shy, introverted teenage boy. And I thought, I've got no gifts, no skills, nothing. What would God ever use me for? And I remember saying this to my friend. And I remember him just saying to me, no, actually, God has given us all gifts and abilities. And if you're willing, he will show you what they are and he will use you. Then I remember him just praying for me outside my house on that Thursday night. And I couldn't have believed then, if you had told me, what would have happened over the subsequent 20-something years. The opportunities that I've had to speak about the Christian faith in so many different contexts, to travel to different parts of the world, to be able to write books. None of these things were ever on my imagination. But God did have a plan and a purpose, and he had given me gifts. And I sometimes think, well, why me? And then I think God's answer is, well, exactly. Not because you're special, precisely because we're all ordinary, but God can do extraordinary things through ordinary people that are available to being used by him. So, yeah, that would be my favorite book and my favorite verse if you want a verse too. Oh, this question is almost as difficult as asking my favorite book of the Bible because, well, there have been so many people that God has put into my life for which I'm so grateful for, that I could talk about. I could talk about my parents. My dad became a follower of Jesus when he was a student, and that obviously has impacted my life, and their quiet but faithful and consistent life and witness to me. Then there's been what we might call famous Christians, people that I've been able to read their books and listen to their talks, and a few of whom that I've been able to get to know over the years. Certainly an evangelist, same name as mine, Michael, but Michael Green, who died back in 2019, was a great influence to me over 10 years. He was in his 80s, I was in my 20s and 30s, but it was really wonderful being able to work and learn from him. And actually, the thing that really struck me about Michael was, yes, he was an academic, he was a theologian, he was an evangelist, he'd written 50 books, he was an excellent speaker. But actually, the thing that really struck me about him was his humility. He didn't have pretensions to grandeur. He was just very humble. If he came into a room and all the chairs were taken, he would sit on the floor. If there was a volunteer needed to wash the dishes, he would be the first to be out in the kitchen rolling his sleeves up and so on. And that genuine humility, which of course models the humility of Jesus, was something that was so impactful for me. So Michael really was a great influence. But if I'm allowed actually one person even more than Michael, it'd be someone that no one will have ever necessarily heard of, but he was a friend, and as a child, he was my youth leader, as a teacher in my church. And then for a while, he was my boss. I worked on his farm. He was a local farmer just outside the city where I grew up. So I used to work on his farm in the summers. And actually, it was his friendship and mentoring and encouragement over the years that has been probably the biggest, most shaping influence in my life. In fact, when we got married 5 years ago, I invited him to be my best man because of that ongoing influence that he's had. And I share that story about Tim because sometimes we think of, the famous Christians, the people who've written books, the people who've preached, the people who have platforms, and we think, oh, they're the ones that can really influence people's lives. But actually, I would say the person who has influenced my life the most is not an eloquent preacher, has never written a book, and has spent his life as a farmer, and yet has massively impacted my life. And the encouragement from that is that actually, whoever we are and whatever position we're in, actually, if we allow him, God can use us to influence the lives of others in profound ways. Yeah. Relaxing and recharging. Now, that is something I am good at. Well, maybe I'm not actually. My wife tells me I struggle to relax. My favorite form of relaxation, strangely speaking, would be cycling. And I know that doesn't sound very relaxing, cycling up a mountain, but when your main work is using your brain a lot, it's quite nice to use your physical body. So yeah, I love road cycling. I'll get out and do that. Um, and I find that is a really good way of recharging. I come back refreshed. It's amazing, actually. They've found out now, haven't they, that doing physical exercise releases endorphins. There's a scientific reason why doing exercise makes us feel better. And so I love cycling. I love swimming, especially in cold water. Again, scientific proof that cold water swimming releases endorphins. So I'm all down with the science. And then on top of that, gardening is a hobby that I love. So we've got a garden at home, so I love getting out there, just seeing things grow, getting my hands in the soil, being connected with nature in that way. And also I love hiking. So we don't live in mountains, but there's a few mountains about 3 hours from where we live. So if I get a day and the weather's good, I'll drive off into the mountains and I'll spend a day hiking. So yeah, cycling, swimming, hiking, gardening, cooking, baking, any of those are good by me. Well, most of my work is with university students, and one of the joys and humorous I- elements of working with students is that sometimes, they're not always as organized, and sometimes they're not always experienced. Maybe nearly 20 years ago now, I was invited to go and speak for a Christian union, a Christian student group in the north of England, and they'd never organized any events before. And so we had a curry night, Indian curry, and I was to give the talk. And I was slightly intrigued that the venue was called Passion Palace. And so I asked them, where is this venue? And it transpired that it was a venue that was normally used as a strip club. So like this was not the kind of venue that I was expecting for a kind of Christian meeting. Now, thankfully, it wasn't being used for stripping on the night that we were using it. It happened to be free. And I said, why did you pick the strip club for your evangelistic talk? And they said, oh, it was the cheapest venue we could find. So here we were having a curry night in the strip club, and I'm giving a talk from the Bible. Anyway, so we're in the meeting. Thankfully, there was no pictures or anything around the room. And there was a barman who was serving us that night from Afghanistan. And he was from a Muslim background. And the poor guy, he'd been left to serve about 100 people all on his own. So the whole evening took forever. It was all disorganized. It was crazy. But obviously, people were very loving towards this guy. And so he was quite impressed that the way that people treated him was much better than the normal clientele that they had in this particular establishment. And so at the end of the evening, we chatted at length, and he had a lot of questions about the Christian faith off the back of the talk. I remember we had this conversation. It went on for about an hour, and he was serving me Coca-Cola, not the drugs. You're never sure what you're going to get in a strip club. So he's serving me this Coca-Cola, but the machine had broken, so it was kind of pouring out far too much Coke, the neat stuff. So I was getting kind of high on caffeine as I was drinking this Coke, talking to this guy from Afghanistan. But wonderfully, he then started coming to church, and he came to know Jesus, and still going on with Jesus today. And I thought, isn't that a wonderful story? This student group book a strip club to do a Christian meeting, and a Muslim from Afghanistan discovers Jesus in the process. So sometimes God does things that we don't expect in ways that I wouldn't have planned, and it's all part of the fun.